February 1st, 1943. Somewhere over the Tunisian desert, 20,000 feet above the Sahara. A German Messerschmitt 109 rolls toward a Boeing B-17 bomber at over 300 miles per hour. The pilot is already wounded. His oxygen tanks are burning. He is trying to pull away beneath the American bomber when his controls stop responding. For one horrible instant, the fighter hangs suspended in the air directly beneath the B-17. Then it strikes. The Messerschmitt's wing slices diagonally through the top rear fuselage of the bomber, opening a gash over 16 feet long and 4 feet wide at its widest point. The left horizontal stabilizer tears away completely. Control cables snap. Pieces of German aircraft remain lodged in what is left of the American tail section. The entire rear of the bomber now sways up to 18 inches out of alignment, held together by a narrow strip of aluminum that was never designed to bear such stress. Inside the crippled aircraft, 10 American airmen have just seconds to decide whether to bail out over enemy territory or trust that this mangled collection of aluminum and rivets can somehow carry them home. 300 miles of open desert lie between them and safety. Every principle of aeronautical engineering says this aircraft should be falling out of the sky. It does not fall. Against all logic, against every calculation of structural integrity, the B-17 keeps flying. And 90 minutes later, Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg Jr. brings his shattered bomber down on a runway in Algeria without a single crew member injured. This is the story of the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. Not the fastest bomber of World War II, not the highest flying, not even the hardest hitting, but the one that did something no other aircraft of its era could match. It absorbed catastrophic damage and brought its crew home alive. This is the story of the machine that America built so tough it could fly home with no tail, and the men who trusted their lives to it. The B-17 Flying Fortress emerged from a design competition that Boeing nearly did not survive. In August of 1934, the United States Army Air Corps issued a requirement for a new multi-engine bomber capable of flying over 2,000 miles while carrying a substantial bomb load. Most manufacturers submitted twin-engine designs. Boeing's team, led by project engineers E. Gifford Emery and Edward Curtis Wells, took a different approach. They proposed a 4-engine heavy bomber that would prioritize structural redundancy and crew survivability over raw performance. The gamble nearly destroyed the company. On October 30th, 1935, the Model 299 prototype crashed during takeoff at Wright Field, Ohio, killing 2 crew members, including the Army's chief test pilot. The cause was pilot error, not mechanical failure. The crew had forgotten to disengage the gust locks on the control surfaces. But the crash eliminated Boeing from the competition and nearly bankrupted the company. The Army Air Corps, however, recognized the aircraft's potential. They ordered 13 test aircraft, designated YB-17, and continued development. The result was the Model 299, which first flew on July 28, 1935. When a reporter saw the prototype bristling with defensive machine gun positions, he called it a flying fortress. Boeing immediately trademarked the name. Through the late 1930s, Boeing refined the design through successive variants. The B-17B added turbochargers for high-altitude performance. The B-17C introduced self-sealing fuel tanks and armor plating. The B-17D improved defensive armament. By December 7, 1941, when Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor, the Army Air Forces had fewer than 200 B-17s in service. Within 4 years, American factories would produce over 12,700 more. The B-17G, which became the definitive variant of the war with 8,680 built, carried a standard crew of 10 men. The pilot and co-pilot sat side by side in the cockpit. Below and ahead of them, the bombardier operated the Norden bomb sight in the plexiglass nose, while the navigator worked at his table behind. The flight engineer manned the upper turret directly behind the cockpit, watching the engines and the sky above simultaneously. The radio operator worked in a compartment behind the bomb bay, also manning a single .50 caliber machine gun through a hatch in the top of the fuselage. 2 waist gunners stood at open windows on either side of the rear fuselage, fighting frostbite and enemy fighters simultaneously in temperatures that reached -40 degrees at high altitude. Beneath them, in the most dangerous position on the aircraft, The ball turret gunner curled into a steel sphere barely large enough to contain a man, suspended beneath the belly of the bomber with nothing between him and the ground, 5 miles below but a quarter-inch of armor steel and his own courage. At the very rear, the tail gunner crouched in a cramped compartment with twin 50-caliber machine guns, often the first to see enemy fighters and the last to see anything if they succeeded in their attack. The isolation of the tail position was profound. Separated from the rest of the crew by dozens of feet of aluminum, connected only by intercom, and the thin hope that the men up front were still alive, tail gunners watched the war unfold behind them in a way no one else could. Every position on the aircraft carried its own particular terror. The pilots faced the responsibility of keeping 10 men alive while flying a damaged aircraft through hostile skies. The bombardier bore the weight of knowing that a single error in the final moments over the target could cost lives on the ground and render the entire mission meaningless. The navigator worked furiously to track their position across a featureless landscape obscured by clouds and smoke, knowing that a wrong turn could lead them into the heaviest flak or the most concentrated fighter defenses. The gunners faced the constant knowledge that they were the first targets for enemy pilots seeking to silence the bomber's defenses. The aircraft mounted up to 13 Browning ANM 250 caliber machine guns, distributed across a chin turret, dorsal turret, ball turret, tail turret, 2 cheek positions, 2 waist positions, and a radio room mount. 4 Wright Cyclone R, 18-20-97. Radial engines produced 1,200 horsepower each, equipped with General Electric turbochargers. The aircraft cruised at 170 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, with a service ceiling of approximately 35,600 feet and a wingspan of 103 feet 9 inches. Normal bomb load was 6,000 pounds, though with external racks this could reach 17,600 pounds. 3 design features made the B-17 uniquely survivable among the heavy bombers of its era. First, its semi-monocoque fuselage distributed structural loads across bulkheads, stiffeners, longerons, and stressed metal skin rather than concentrating them in any single element. Damage to any section was absorbed by surrounding structure without cascading failure. This explained how Lieutenant Bragg's aircraft could fly 300 miles, with its fuselage nearly cut in two. Second, the dual-spar wing design provided critical redundancy. Unlike the B-24 Liberator's innovative but structurally fragile Davis wing with its single main spar, the B-17's thicker wing with 2 spars meant a shell passing through caused localized damage, while the redundant spar carried loads around the wound. This distinction was the single most important factor separating the B-17's reputation from that of its faster rival. Third, self-sealing fuel tanks composed of 2 layers of rubber, an inner vulcanized fuel-resistant layer and an outer untreated natural rubber layer, automatically sealed bullet holes when fuel seeped into the rubber and caused it to swell. First introduced on the B-17C in 1940, these tanks reliably sealed 30 caliber punctures and could handle 50 caliber holes with reasonable effectiveness. The aircraft also carried approximately 650 pounds of steel armor plating protecting the pilots and critical crew positions, along with bullet-resistant glass panels. The B-17 could fly on 2 engines, whether on the same side or in cross configuration. Its 4 independent fuel systems with cross-feed capability meant a hit to one fuel line did not starve all 4 engines. Dual control yokes, redundant control cables, and multiple oxygen systems with 16 outlets provided further backup. Boeing promoted from the very beginning that the Model 299 was the first combat aircraft that could continue its mission if one of its 4 engines failed. By 1942, America needed every ounce of that survivability. The 8th Air Force's daylight strategic bombing campaign over Europe became the deadliest sustained aerial operation in history. It began on August 17, 1942, when 12 B-17s of the 97th Bomb Group bombed railroad marshalling yards at Rouen, France. It ended 986 missions later, on May 8, 1945. In between, approximately 26,000 8th Air Force airmen were killed. This was more than the entire United States Marine Corps lost across the Pacific. Another 28,000 became prisoners of war. Of the 350,000 airmen who served with the 8th, 2/3 of those who flew combat could expect to die, be wounded, or be captured. The strategy behind these staggering losses was rooted in pre-war doctrine. American air power theorists believed that formations of heavily armed bombers flying in tight defensive boxes could fight their way to targets deep in enemy territory without fighter escort, destroy precision industrial targets by daylight, and fight their way back home. The reality proved far bloodier than the theory. A typical mission began long before dawn. Ground crews worked through the night preparing aircraft, loading bombs, fueling tanks, and testing systems. At 3 or 4 in the morning, crew members were awakened in their Nissen huts, served a breakfast of powdered eggs and coffee, and driven to briefing rooms where they learned their target for the day. When the briefing officer pulled back the curtain to reveal the red ribbons stretching across the map to a city deep in Germany, groans and curses filled the room. Everyone knew what those long ribbons meant. Takeoff began around 6 in the morning. Heavily loaded B-17s, carrying up to 8,000 pounds of bombs and nearly 3,000 gallons of fuel, struggled into the grey English sky. The takeoff itself was dangerous. A fully loaded B-17 weighed over 65,000 pounds and needed nearly every foot of runway to become airborne. Engines strained at maximum power. Crews held their breath until the wheels left the ground. Mid-air collisions during assembly killed more men than some enemy attacks. Assembly took hours as hundreds of aircraft from dozens of bases climbed through the overcast, formed into groups, and joined into massive combat boxes, sometimes stretching 60 miles long. The formations were designed to concentrate defensive firepower. Each bomber protected its neighbors with overlapping fields of fire. Breaking formation meant death, either from fighters picking off stragglers or from friendly fire as gunners lost track of friend and foe. At 18,000 feet, crew members went on oxygen. At 20,000 feet and above, temperatures dropped to -40 degrees. Frostbite was endemic. Gunners had to remove gloves to clear jammed weapons, and sometimes lost fingers to the cold metal. Electric heated flying suits frequently malfunctioned. Men urinated into relief tubes that froze solid. The roar of 4 engines made communication nearly impossible without intercom systems that often failed. Then came the enemy. The original combat tour was 25 missions, later increased to 30, and then 35 as the air war's character changed. During 1942 and 43, before long-range fighter escorts were available, only 35% of bomber crews completed their tour. For the 100th Bomb Group, forever known as the Bloody 100th, only 14% of flyers assigned in May of 1943 made it to their 25th mission. In late 1943, a B-17's statistical life expectancy was 11 missions. Historian Donald Miller framed it bluntly. 77% of those who flew before D-Day became casualties. The campaign's darkest period came in the autumn of 1943. On August 17th, the Schweinfurt-Regensburg double strike cost 60 B-17s, 16% of the 376 dispatched, leaving 600 empty bunks in English barracks that evening. On October 14th, forever known as Black Thursday, 291 B-17s attacked Schweinfurt's ball-bearing factories. 60 were shot down over Germany, 5 crashed approaching Britain, and 17 more were damaged beyond repair. Over 600 aircrew were killed, wounded, or missing. Deep penetration raids into Germany were suspended until long-range fighter escorts became available. The men who flew these missions faced a bifurcated threat, and the one that killed more of them was not enemy fighters. Research by historian Donald Nijboer found that of American aircraft lost over Germany, 5,380 fell to anti-aircraft fire versus 4,274 to fighters. Germany's flak arm grew from 791 heavy batteries in 1940 to 2,655 heavy batteries by 1944, anchored by the feared 88mm gun that could hurl a 20-pound shell above 20,000 feet. The flak was heaviest over major industrial targets. As bombers approached, they had to maintain level flight for the bomb run, making them perfectly predictable targets for flak batteries below. German gunners calculated altitude, speed, and direction, then filled the sky with timed explosive shells. Crew members described the flak as thick enough to walk on. Black puffs of smoke appeared ahead, then all around, then close enough to rock the aircraft. The smell of cordite seeped into the cabin. Shrapnel tore through aluminum skin, wounded men, and shattered instruments. There was nothing to do but hold formation and pray. Against this backdrop of almost certain death, the B-17 earned its legend not through statistics, but through individual acts of survival that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Return now to that February morning over Tunisia. The B-17F, known as All-American 3, serial number 4124406, was assigned to the 414th Bombardment Squadron of the 97th Bombardment Group, 12th Air Force. The aircraft was based at Biskra Airfield in Algeria, a desert oasis roughly 300 miles southeast of the Mediterranean coast. Pilot Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg Jr. was a member of the 1938 Duke Blue Devils football backfield, who played in the Rose Bowl, born March 24, 1918, in Savannah, Georgia. He had named the bomber All-American because his crew hailed from all across the country. Co-pilot Second Lieutenant Godfrey Engel Jr. occupied the right seat. Navigator Second Lieutenant Harry C. Newsell plotted their course, while Bombardier Second Lieutenant Ralph Burbridge manned the Norden bomb site. Flight Engineer Staff Sergeant Joseph C. James Jr. watched over the engines from the top turret. Radio Operator Staff Sergeant Paul A. Galloway worked his equipment in the radio room. Ball turret gunner Sergeant Elton A. Conder curled into his steel sphere beneath the fuselage. Waist gunner Sergeant Michael A. Zook Sr. stood at his position. Tail gunner Sergeant Sam A. Tony Sarpolis crouched in the rear compartment watching for fighters. That morning, All-American departed Biskra for a bombing mission against German-controlled port facilities at Bizerte and Tunis, Tunisia, approximately 300 miles northwest. The objective was to cripple Axis logistics, supplying Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's forces. The aircraft flew in formation behind and to the right of the lead B-17, Flaming Mamie, piloted by Major Robert Coulter. The formation bombed from 20,000 feet through heavy flak, that Bombardier Burbridge later described as very frightening. The collision that would make All-American famous occurred after the bombs had already been dropped, during the return flight to base. Burbridge was explicit in interviews decades later. Long after they had left the target, two Bf-109 G4 fighters from Jagdgeschwader 53 were spotted climbing to intercept. The German pilots were Oberleutnant Julius Meimberg, who had 31 victories at that point, and Feldwebel Erich Patzier, who had 14 victories. The two fighters pressed a head-on attack. Burbridge covered the approaching fighters with the 30 caliber nose gun, while navigator Newsell fired the 50 caliber gun on the right side of the nose. Combined fire from All-American and Flaming Mamie hit Meimberg's aircraft, igniting his oxygen tanks and forcing him to bail out with severe burns. Patzier continued his attack run. Burbridge recalled that his wings looked as though they were afire from his flaming guns. At roughly 300 yards, Patzier began rolling to pull away beneath All-American. He never completed the maneuver. About halfway through his roll, either fire from Burbridge or fire from the lead ship must have killed the pilot or disabled the plane. Crew accounts describe the moment vividly. For one horrible instant he was right there, inches in front and above them. He passed over with a distinctly audible swoosh, followed by a tremendous jar and a whoomp. The disabled Messerschmitt struck All-American's fuselage. Patzier was killed. According to one account from Bombardier Alfred Blair aboard Flaming Mamie, the fighter may have struck Flaming Mamie first and bounced into All-American. Flaming Mamie was destroyed, killing 7 of its 10 crew. The damage to All-American was catastrophic. The Messerschmitt's wing sliced diagonally through the top rear fuselage, opening that gash over 16 feet long and 4 feet wide at its widest point. The left horizontal stabilizer and left elevator were completely torn away. Control cables were severed. The vertical fin and rudder were damaged. Radios, electrical systems, and oxygen systems were wrecked. Pieces of the Messerschmitt's wings remained lodged in the bomber's tail. Only a narrow strip of metal airframe near the right tailplane kept the tail section attached, and it swayed up to 18 inches out of alignment. The 10-man crew immediately donned parachutes. Ball turret gunner Conder, a substitute from the 341st Bomb Squadron, who had dismissively asked Bragg before the mission whether he could fly the damned plane, now waited to see if they would survive. Critically, although conventional cable controls were severed, the crew discovered they could still maintain limited flight control. Some accounts credit the Norden bombsite's C1 autopilot system, which operated through separate electric wires connecting to motor servos mounted next to the rudder and elevator. Others describe Bragg using throttle adjustments and one remaining elevator cable. Whatever the exact combination, it worked. Lieutenant Bragg made several practice approaches at altitude during the 90-minute return flight, unsure at what speed the remaining tail section might stall. Upon reaching Biskra, they fired 3 emergency flares and orbited at 2,000 feet waiting for clearance. The tail wheel would not extend. Bragg brought the bomber in carefully, holding the tail off the runway as long as possible, skidding the last 100 yards to a stop. An ambulance rolled up and was waved off. Not a single crew member was injured. The famous aerial photograph of All-American flying with its nearly severed tail was taken by Lieutenant Charles Cliff Cutforth, navigator aboard B-17 Flying Flit gun of the 340th Bomb Squadron. Many embellished accounts claim the photo was taken by a P-51 pilot over the English Channel. This is false. The mission took place over North Africa, 300 miles from any channel. After landing, the tail section collapsed when 3 curious airmen from another crew climbed inside to inspect the damage. Tail gunner Sarpolus was asked why the plane had not broken in two, and at that precise moment the tail broke apart under their weight. Ground Crew Chief Herman R. Halen Jr. had tears in his eyes. The ground crew had given them up for dead. Burbridge recalled the emotion of that moment for the rest of his life. All-American was eventually repaired with a replacement tail section and reassigned to the 301st Bombardment Group, but the field-riveting work left her sluggish and problematic. She completed only one more combat mission before being relegated to utility transport duty. The aircraft was dismantled for salvage at Lucera Airfield, Italy, on March 6, 1945. All 10 crew members survived the war. Bragg lived until 1999, Engel until 2007, Burbridge until 2013. Ball turret gunner Conda, who had doubted whether Bragg could fly the damned plane, walked up to the pilot after landing and gave him a long, firm handshake without saying a word. The survival of All-American was extraordinary, but it was not unique. Across the European and Pacific theaters, B-17s returned from missions with damage that seemed to mock the very concept of aircraft structural limits. On December 20th, 1943, Second Lieutenant Charles L. Charlie Brown of Weston, West Virginia, flew his first combat mission as pilot of B-17 F. Old Pub, serial number 423167, assigned to the 527th Bombardment Squadron of the 379th Bombardment Group, based at RAF Kimballton, England. The target was the Focke-Wulf 190 factory in Bremen, Germany. Brown's crew was assigned to Purple Heart Corner, the most exposed position in the bomber formation. The mission went catastrophically wrong. Before bombs away at 27,300 feet, the number 2 engine was knocked out and number 4 damaged. After dropping their bombs, the crippled bomber fell out of formation and was attacked by more than a dozen Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s from Jagdgeschwader 11 for over 10 minutes. The number 3 engine was reduced to half power. The tail section was shot to pieces. The nose cone was destroyed. Electrical, hydraulic, and oxygen systems failed. Only one of 11 defensive guns remained operational. Tail gunner Sergeant Hugh S. Eckenrode was killed, the crew's sole fatality. Multiple crew members were wounded, including Brown, who took shrapnel in the shoulder. The aircraft went into an uncontrolled dive, and Brown recovered it at approximately 3,000 feet near Oldenburg. At Jever Airfield, Oberleutnant Franz Stigler, a 28-year-old Bavarian veteran of Jagdgeschwader 27 with roughly 27 aerial victories, had already shot down 2 B-17s that day. One more would earn him the Knight's Cross, Germany's highest military decoration. He scrambled his Messerschmitt 109 G6 when Ye Old Pub limped overhead at extremely low altitude. What Stigler saw through the holes in the fuselage changed everything. He could see the dead tail gunner slumped at his position. He could see wounded men inside. He remembered the words of his former commanding officer, Gustav Rodel, who had told pilots in North Africa that if he ever heard of any of them shooting at someone in a parachute, he would shoot them himself. Stigler later explained that to him, it was just like they were in a parachute. He saw them, and he could not shoot them down. Stigler tried twice to signal Brown to land at a German airfield or divert to neutral Sweden. Brown could not decipher the gestures. Stigler then flew in close formation on the bomber's port wing, preventing German anti-aircraft batteries from firing on it. He escorted Ye Old Pub across the German coastline and out over the North Sea, then saluted and departed. Brown flew approximately 250 miles across the open water and landed at RAF Seething in Norfolk. At debriefing, he reported the German pilot's actions and was told the information was classified. The two men's paths diverged for 46 years. Stigler, who would have faced execution for his actions, reportedly claimed he had shot down the B-17 over the sea. He later flew Messerschmitt 262 jets with Adolf Gallen's elite Jagdverband 44 and emigrated to Vancouver, Canada, in 1953. Brown retired from the Air Force as a lieutenant colonel in 1965. In 1990, after years of searching, Brown placed a letter in the German Fighter Pilots Association newsletter. On January 18, 1990, he received a letter from Canada with 4 words: "I was the one." Brown and Stigler became inseparable friends, traveling the country together to tell their story. Franz Stigler died March 22, 2008. Charlie Brown died November 24, 2008, 8 months later. Their story was immortalized in Adam Marcos's 2012 bestseller, A Higher Call, and in the Swedish metal band Sabaton's song, No Bullets Fly. Other B-17s wrote their own chapters in this ongoing testament to survival. The B-17F Thunderbird, serial number 4124437, of the 341st Bomb Squadron, completed over 100 combat missions before being salvaged in November of 1944. Its most famous moment came on January 12, 1943, during a raid on Castel Benito Aerodrome near Tripoli, piloted by Lieutenant John Cronkite with Lieutenant Dana F. Dudley as co-pilot. Thunderbird lost 2 engines on the right side just as bombs were released. For nearly 80 miles, the crew fought off enemy fighters while nursing the crippled bomber home, flying so low through a mountain chain that the wings cleared the ground by less than 5 feet. 3 men were wounded. The crew shot down 6 enemy aircraft. Legendary war correspondent Ernie Pyle immortalized the story, and General Eisenhower reportedly called it his favorite story of the war. The incident became one of several that inspired the 1943 hit song Comin' In on a Wing and a Prayer. In the Pacific Theater, the B-17 Old 666, serial number 412666, produced what may be the most decorated single aircrew in American military history. On June 16, 1943, Captain J. Zima, Jr. and his volunteer crew, nicknamed the Eager Beavers, flew a solo photo mapping mission over Bougainville Island, 600 miles from their base at Port Moresby, New Guinea. Zima's crew had rescued the junked B-17 from a boneyard, replaced all 4 engines, and mounted an extraordinary 16 active 50 caliber machine guns, plus 3 spares. When approximately 17 to 20 Japanese A-6M30s attacked, Bombardier Second Lieutenant Joseph R. Sarnowski was mortally wounded but dragged himself back to his gun and scored hits on another fighter before dying. Zima was gravely wounded when a 20mm cannon shell tore through the nose, shattering his rudder pedals and instrument panel, breaking his leg in multiple places and wounding both arms. The running fight lasted 40 minutes. The aircraft sustained 187 bullet holes and 5 cannon hits. Both Zima and Sarnowski received the Medal of Honor, Sarnowski's posthumously. All 7 surviving crew members received the Distinguished Service Cross. On October 15, 1944, a B-17G of the 398th Bomb Group, piloted by First Lieutenant Lawrence Delancey, had its entire nose section destroyed by a direct hit from a German 88mm shell over Cologne. Toggle operator Staff Sergeant George Edward Abbott was killed instantly. Navigator Second Lieutenant Raymond J. Ledoux, sitting 3 feet from the explosion, survived. With no instruments, no radio, no intercom, and wind howling through the open nose at 27,000 feet in sub-zero temperatures, Delancey flew the howling wreck back to England. Ground crews heard the unearthly whistling before the plane was visible. 9 of 10 crew survived. The photograph of the noseless B-17 became one of the war's most iconic images. Delancey received the Silver Star. Ledoux, who navigated home by magnetic compass alone, received the Distinguished Flying Cross. Ledoux later named a son, George Abbott Ledoux, after the toggle operator killed beside him. On July 26, 1943, co-pilot Second Lieutenant John C. Red Morgan of B-17F Ruthie II flew a massive bomber with one hand for over 2 hours, while physically restraining the delirious pilot, whose skull had been split open by a cannon shell. Morgan completed the bombing mission, dropped the bombs, and returned to base, suffering broken teeth and 2 black eyes from the pilot's frantic struggles. He received the Medal of Honor and later became the only Medal of Honor recipient to subsequently become a prisoner of war when he was shot down over Berlin on March 6, 1944. The Germans understood what they were facing. Luftwaffe pilots applied the term fliegendes Stachelschwein, meaning flying porcupine, to heavily defended Allied aircraft, including the B-17, for the bristling wall of 50 caliber fire that met any approaching fighter. The standard term for all heavy bombers was Wehrmacht, short for Wehrmotorige, meaning 4-engine. Pilots who specialized in destroying them were called Wehrmacht-Experten. German analysis of wreckage determined it took at least 20 hits with 20mm cannon shells from the rear to bring down a B-17. Given that the average pilot scored hits with only 2% of rounds fired, achieving 20 hits required aiming roughly 1,000 rounds. But a Focke-Wulf 190 carried only 500 rounds of 20mm cannon ammunition. From the front, the picture was different. Only 4 to 5 well-placed 20mm hits could bring a B-17 down through the less armored cockpit area. The 30mm Mk108 cannon, mounted on later fighters, required only 4 hits on average to destroy a heavy bomber. This arithmetic drove tactical evolution. The head-on attack was pioneered in November of 1942 by Hauptmann Egon Meyer and Oberleutnant Georg Peter Eder of Jagdgeschwader II, who realized that closing head-on at a combined speed of over 500 miles per hour gave gunners only a half-second firing window, while exploiting the B-17's weakest defensive arc. Meyer became the first fighter pilot to claim 100 victories entirely against Western Allied aircraft before being killed on March 2, 1944. The B-17G's chin turret, with twin forward-firing 50 caliber guns, was a direct response to Meyer's tactic. Major Anton Haeckel, who achieved 192 victories, described the terror of rear approaches. If one came in from the rear, there was a long period, closing from 1,000 meters to the firing range of 400 meters, when the bombers were firing but the fighters could not fire back. This was a very dangerous time, and they lost a lot of aircraft trying to attack that way. He concluded that the head-on attack was the only way to knock down the bombers. Karl Boris of Jagdgeschwader 26 described the 50 caliber tracers as swarming like wasps that surrounded fighter cockpits long before pilots could return effective fire, causing many to break away prematurely. A widely repeated saying among Luftwaffe veterans held that attacking a B-17 formation from behind was like trying to make love to a porcupine that is on fire. The courage required to attack a B-17 formation should not be underestimated. German pilots flew straight into a wall of tracer fire, watching their comrades explode or spin away in flames, knowing that even a successful attack might end with their own aircraft crippled over hostile territory. Many young pilots broke away before entering effective firing range, their nerve failing as the tracers grew closer. Those who pressed home their attacks displayed a bravery that transcended national allegiance, the same desperate courage shown by the bomber crews they sought to kill. Sturmgruppe pilot Richard Franz provided the most technically precise account. When they made their attack, they approached from slightly above, then dived, opening fire with 13mm and 20mm guns to knock out the rear gunner, and then, at about 150 meters, they tried to engage with the Mk108 30mm cannon, which was a formidable weapon. It could cut the wing off a B-17. Actually, it was still easier to kill a B-24, which was somewhat weaker in respect of fuselage, strength, and armament. By 1944, the Luftwaffe developed the Sturmgruppe concept, using heavily armored Focke-Wulf 190A, 8R2, Sturmbok fighters with 30mm cannon and armored canopies, escorted by Messerschmitt 109s tasked with fending off American escorts. These formations occasionally achieved devastating results, such as the September 27, 1944 attack, when Sturmgruppe fighters shot down 25 B-24s from the 445th Bomb Group in a single engagement. but the heavily laden Sturmbok fighters were too sluggish to survive encounters with P-51 Mustangs. On November 2, 1944, after destroying over 20 B-17s, American escort fighters caught the Sturmbok formations and inflicted devastating losses, killing dozens of pilots in a single engagement. Hermann Goering had famously dismissed American aviation, reportedly telling Hitler in 1940 that the Americans cannot build aeroplanes and were very good only at refrigerators and razor blades. He was catastrophically wrong. By April of 1944, General Adolf Galland reported that 500 aircraft and 400 pilots had been lost in the previous 10 operations alone, with 1,000 pilots killed in 4 months. The Luftwaffe was being bled white. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang in December of 1943 transformed the campaign. By Big Week in February of 1944, over 600 escort fighters accompanied bombers daily. General Doolittle's controversial decision to release fighters from close escort into offensive sweeps ahead of the bomber stream proved devastatingly effective against the Luftwaffe. By D-Day, on June 6, 1944, Allied air supremacy was effectively complete. Tour completion rates rose to 66% in 1944 and 81% in 1945. Of the 12,731 B-17s built during the war, 4,735 were destroyed in combat. The B-24 Liberator, despite being faster and capable of carrying a heavier bomb load, never earned the same reputation for toughness. Its Davis wing's aerodynamic elegance came at the cost of structural vulnerability. Its thinner profile and single-spar construction meant 20mm and 30mm cannon shells could compromise both upper and lower surfaces simultaneously. The B-24's shoulder-mounted wing placed enormous stress on the fuselage, which could crumple under hard landings. Its hydraulic control systems were more vulnerable to battle damage than the B-17's electrical systems. Most critically, the B-24's roll-away bomb bay doors allowed water to flood the fuselage during emergency water landings, often causing the aircraft to sink rapidly. B-17 crews had significantly better survival rates in ditching situations. Army Air Force's statistical analysis consistently showed that B-24s suffered higher accident rates and more fatalities per flying hour than B-17s, despite carrying similar missions. Post-war analysis confirmed what combat crews already knew. The B-17 was a more efficient combat aircraft than the B-24 from a viewpoint of bomber accuracy, aircraft survivability, and losses per effective sortie. The comparison with the British Avro Lancaster reveals an entirely different design philosophy. The Lancaster, built for RAF Bomber Command's nighttime area bombing campaign, sacrificed defensive armament and crew survivability for bomb load. It carried only .303 caliber machine guns, far inferior to the B-17's 50 caliber weapons, and a massive 14,000-pound standard bomb load. But when a Lancaster was hit, the results were often fatal. Operational research suggested roughly 15% of Lancaster crews survived being shot down, compared to approximately 50% for American heavy bomber crews. The difference partly reflected the aircraft designs, but also the fact that American crews bailing out in daylight could see what they were doing while Lancaster crews abandoned aircraft in darkness. The Lancaster had only 2 main exits, and if the passage was blocked, crews were trapped. Today, of the 12,731 B-17s built, approximately 45 complete airframes survive worldwide. 39 are in the United States and 7 abroad. Only 6 of these survivors actually saw combat in World War II. Most were late production aircraft that served in post-war roles, including air-sea rescue, photo reconnaissance, drone control, weather patrol, and even aerial firefighting. The number of truly airworthy B-17s has dwindled to approximately 3 or 4. Sentimental Journey, serial number 483514, operated by the Commemorative Air Force from Mesa, Arizona, remains the most actively touring example, still offering flight experiences. Ye Old Pub, serial number 448543, based at the Erickson Aircraft Collection in Madras, Oregon, flies regularly and offers 30-minute rides. Sally B, serial number 44858784, is Europe's only airworthy B-17, based at Imperial War Museum, Duxford, and performs annual Memorial Day flypasts over the American Military Cemetery at Madingley, Cambridge. The fleet has suffered grievous losses. On October 2, 2019, the Collins Foundation's 909, serial number 483575, crashed at Bradley International Airport in Connecticut during a passenger flight experience, killing 7 of 13 people aboard, including both pilots. On November 12, 2022, Texas Raiders, serial number 483872, was destroyed in a mid-air collision with a P-63 King Cobra at the wings over Dallas Air Show, killing all 6 people aboard both aircraft. The most significant static display is the B-17F Memphis Belle, serial number 41244485, at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. Among the first B-17s to complete 25 missions, it underwent a 13-year restoration and was unveiled on May 17, 2018. Museum curator Jeff Duford compared its cultural significance to that of the Iwo Jima flag raising and the USS Arizona, calling it a national treasure. Other major museum examples include the city of Savannah at the National Museum of the Mighty 8th Air Force near Savannah, Georgia, restored by volunteers who invested over 60,000 hours. The Boeing B at Seattle's Museum of Flight is considered the finest B-17 restoration in the world. Mary Alice at the American Air Museum at Imperial War Museum, Duxford, provides British visitors with an opportunity to experience the aircraft their parents and grandparents saw filling the skies during the war. Of the more than 16 million Americans who served in World War II, fewer than 50,000 remained alive by late 2025, with the VA projecting roughly 7,000 by 2029. The B-17 bomb group reunion culture that flourished for decades has largely ceased. The 80th anniversary of D-Day, in June of 2024, was widely considered the last major anniversary with surviving participants. The institutional race to preserve their stories has produced remarkable archives. The Library of Congress Veterans History Project holds over 121,000 individual collections of audio, video, photographs, and memoirs. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans has recorded more than 12,000 oral histories. The B-17 has maintained a continuous cultural presence across 8 decades. William Wyler's 1944 documentary, The Memphis Belle, shot during actual combat missions with cameraman Harold Tannenbaum killed during filming, was selected for the National Film Registry in 2001. Gregory Peck starred in the 1949 classic, 12 O'Clock High, still used as a military leadership training tool. Most recently, Apple Television's Masters of the Air, produced by Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks, with a budget exceeding $250 million, followed the 100th bomb group across 9 episodes, introducing the B-17 story to another generation. The B-17 Flying Fortress was not the fastest, highest-flying, or hardest-hitting bomber of World War II. It carried less than half the Lancaster's bomb load and flew shorter missions than the B-24. What it did better than any aircraft before or since was absorb catastrophic damage and bring its crew home alive. That quality, engineered into the airframe by Emery and Wells's team at Boeing in the mid-1930s through redundant spars, distributed structural loads, and self-sealing tanks, transformed the B-17 from a weapons platform into something closer to a life support system. The stories that define the aircraft are ultimately stories about human survival against absurd odds. Kendrick Bragg nursing a bisected bomber 300 miles across the desert with a tail held on by a strip of aluminum. Charlie Brown flying 250 miles across the North Sea with one working gun and a dead tail gunner, spared by an enemy pilot's conscience. Jay Zima flying a junked B-17, bristling with 16 guns into a 40-minute running battle with 17 Zeros, and living to receive the Medal of Honor. John Morgan flying a bomber with one hand while restraining a mortally wounded pilot with the other. Lawrence Delancey bringing home a B-17 with no nose, guided only by a navigator with a magnetic compass and frozen hands. These men survived because the machine around them was designed to fail gracefully, to lose pieces, lose engines, lose entire structural sections, and still fly. The men who flew the B-17, average age barely past 20, facing odds that gave them roughly even chances of completing their tour, deserve nothing less than the truth of what they endured and what brought them home. They were fathers, sons, brothers, and husbands who climbed into aluminum tubes filled with high-octane fuel and high explosives, flew into skies filled with flak and fighters, and trusted their lives to an aircraft that seemed determined to bring them back no matter how badly it was hurt. Within a decade, no living person will remember flying one in combat. The aircraft's transition from living memory to pure history makes factual precision in telling these stories not merely important but essential. The B-17 Flying Fortress stands as testament to what American engineering could accomplish when the mission was not just to destroy, but to survive. It was a machine built to take punishment and bring men home, and against all odds, again and again, that is exactly what it did.